Hello and welcome back to part 3 of the series of lectures on cross-classified models. My name is Professor Bill Browne and I co-direct the Multi-Level Modelling Centre. And in this part, I'm going to look at extensions to the standard cross-classified model, which we've seen where we have 2 higher classifications, and also extending out into other applications. So let's have a summary of where we've got to so far. So in the first of these 3 lectures, I started us off and I introduced the idea of cross-classified models. I kind of motivated that by talking a little bit about multi-level models in general, in particular more nested cases, and then showed what the difference was with cross-classified models through some illustrative examples, and gave some background into a practical example that we'll be using in a practical that you can follow along with, but also that was covered in lecture 2. And in lecture 2, my colleague George Leckie took over, and he talked about how we fit cross-classified models in practice. In this lecture, he also introduced some notation for cross-classified models and some useful diagrams called classification diagrams. And I will exploit both the notation and the diagrams in this lecture that we look at here. So in this lecture, really, we're going to look at 2 further examples. Okay, and these are going to illustrate extensions. So the example we looked at, this practical example, the Fife data set that we've looked at so far, that data set has 2 higher classifications. It has primary schools and secondary schools, and it has a response variable that we assume is normally distributed. Okay, in reality, it actually takes values 1 to 10 and integer values, but we're assuming we can fit a normal response model to it. In other words, the residuals from that model will look normally distributed, and they do to a certain degree as well. We're going to move out of social sciences completely here. We're going to look at 2 examples, one from human medicine. And we're going to look at the issue of artificial insemination and how we could use cross-classified models on a data set to do with an artificial insemination. And actually, we're looking at insemination in a slightly different frame here. We're going to look at biology or ecology, probably more truthfully, in our 3rd and final example. And this is to do with small birds called great tits and how successful or not they are in their nesting attempts, using a data set from Wytham Woods, which is near Oxford. Okay. So let's move along. So these are extensions, and as I've said, the models we've looked at so far have really assumed we have a normal response. Okay, the response variable, and in fact, actually the residuals from the model fit follow normal distributions. In other words, the data has to be approximately continuous. But as with the nested models that you'll be more familiar with, and linear models more generally, it's possible to fit other response types. You know, data doesn't all come as continuous data or can be transformed into continuous data. Often data will be binary, it might be a count, or it could be a category. Okay, and we're going to focus here in these 2 examples on binary data, and we will have some more continuous data on the second example. But the Fife example, what it has is 2 classifications. Okay, we've got primary school and we've got secondary school, and we cannot nest primary school within secondary school or secondary school within primary school. But of course, there are many ways that we can classify data, and we may end up with several candidate classifications. We might have more than 2. So the extensions we're going to look at, the artificial insemination example has 3 higher classifications, and the great tit ecology example that has 4 higher classifications. So let's move on then to those examples. Let's look at, we're going to call it example 2 because Fife is example 1. And this is data that originates with David Clayton and his collaborator Rennie Echoshar. They analysed this in a paper in 1998. And David Clayton again looked at this as his example with our former colleague John Rasbash, who we've mentioned, I think, in earlier in passing, they developed a new algorithm called the AIP, or Alternated Imputation and Prediction algorithm, for fitting cross-classified models, and in that paper in 1999, and this was the example that they used. So David Clayton used to work at MRC Biostatistics Unit, and this is a medical example. And what we're looking at here is clinics that help women who've had trouble conceiving babies. And so what we have is a data set of lots of measures of what we call ovulatory cycles. And these are where a woman will have an attempt to become pregnant in each of these cycles. And so we've got a nested data set here. And if we look at the top half of this unit diagram down here, we have cycles nested within women. Okay, so we have a nice, this chunk here, this is a nice nested data set. So women will generally keep having, it won't be a kind of a random pattern. Usually what we'll find is that we'll have cycles where the woman doesn't get pregnant, and then of course she will then get pregnant. And it's possible, I guess, that she would come back to the clinic and try again for another baby. But so we're going to take that data as 0, 1 data. So 1 means that a baby is conceived during a given cycle. So there we are, a nice nested model, but we have more information than that. Because this is a clinic, what we know is something about the sperm that are used for the cycle. So we have sperm donors at the bottom here, and those sperm donors give donations. And the reality here is that each sperm donation can be split up, so it can be used in more than one cycle. So if we look at this example here, we've got this first donor, M1. They've got 2 donations, donation 1 and donation 2. And donation 1's been split up and it's been used for woman 1 for cycle 1 and woman 2 for cycle 2. Then their second donation was again used for this first woman in cycle 2 and was used for woman 3 for cycle 4. And so what we have is we have done this bit of the model, we have lots of crossing, and actually down here we have a nice nested structure again. Okay, so donations are nested within donors, and we can represent that in the classification diagram over here. So we've got cycles at the bottom, crossed between donations and women, and donations themselves are nested within donors. And that's nice. It's nice to have this classification diagram to show people what's going on in the structure. From a computational perspective, all the computer software, the MCMC algorithms at least need to know, is that they were these free higher classifications. And this relationship here is not really used in the algorithm. I mean, if the donor had been just here as an extra blob in the middle, it would have made no difference to the algorithm, because we're assuming unique IDs. So each donation has to have a unique ID, each donor and each woman. Okay, so that's what we've got in this example. And we've only got this is a very short example. We've got one more slide where we talk about the model and the results. So here on the right-hand side is our model. On the left-hand side, sorry, don't know my left from my right. And here we can see the equations for this model. So we have yi, we're using this notation that was developed by myself and colleagues, this single substrate notation. So yi stands for the ith cycle in this data set. Okay, and y takes value 1 if there was a successful pregnancy or successful conception, and 0 if not. Okay, and so because it's binary data, we use a Bernoulli, or if you like, a binomial denominator 1 distribution with parameter pi I. Now, pi I is the probability of a successful conception on this cycle. So we're going to use a logistic regression type function here. So we've got logit pi I, the logistic regression of that probability. And in this bit here, x beta, we're going to put a whole load of predictive inputs, things that we've measured for that cycle. Okay, they may be things about the woman, they may be things about the donation, they could be about the time. Okay, so and then we're gonna say, well, which of the various classifications is the most important? So here we've got 3 terms. We've got one random effect for the woman involved in that cycle, one for the donation that's been involved, the specific donation of sperm, and one for the donor who did that, who gave that donation. Okay, and we assume normal distributions here, so this is random effects for each of these terms. We fitted this model using MCMC. In theory, you could have done this in Eagles or the AIP algorithm that Clayton and Rasbach developed, but we found it easier to use MCMC. And we can see some results on this right-hand side. And what we can see down the bottom here are the 3 sources of variation. And we can see the relative magnitudes of these variabilities. So what that shows is actually the woman level variance is the biggest, and then the donation, and then the donor. Okay, so in actual fact, there's a lot more variation between women in terms of whether they become pregnant or not than there is for the donations. But even there, some donations are more, there's more variation there. So there's more difference between donations than there is between donors. Okay, so that makes sense to use different donations from the same donor as a result of that. And here are some explanatory variables that we've put in the model. This is in the X beta bit. So we have firstly, the intercept is very small and negative, so that suggests quite a negative term here. I'm not sure whether these predictors have been centered or not, so I wouldn't try and describe that number at all. But what we can see, for example, is azoospermia. This predictor here has a positive effect. Okay, and that sort of azoospermia is kind of meaning that the poor quality sperm in a way. But actually the azoospermia is actually a condition, so either you're azoospermic or not. And you might say, well, why would that be positive? Well, this is actually a predictor associated with the partner of the woman, not with the donor of the donation. So what this is saying, why it's positive? Well, if the partner is suffering from azoospermia, then it's more likely to be him rather than the woman involved that is causing the difficulty in becoming pregnant. So therefore, such women whose partners have azoospermia are more likely to become pregnant in this thing. The quality of the semen used, that's quite straightforward. So that's a positive effect. So the higher quality, the better. Both women and men's fertility reduces as age goes on. So we've just got a dummy variable for that, whether the woman's older or younger than 35, and there's a negative effect there. So the older women are having more difficulty. The count has a positive, so we've got a higher sperm count in the sperm that you've seen. That's positive. The motility doesn't seem to make much difference here, the movement term here. There's not a significant effect. And then we've got a couple of the timing effects. So if the woman is inseminated too early, that's got quite a large negative effect. And if it's too late, it's also a negative effect, but not of the same magnitude. So there we are. We've seen a cross-classified example. This top part where we're looking at the different variables, that's very much like any other sort of logistic regression model. But down here, we can partition the variability. So we can see which of these sources of variation. And it seems like women are actually more important than the donations that are being used in this case. Okay, so that's an interesting example. Let's move on then to our second example. And this involves data that I personally analysed. So this is the Wytham Woods graded data set. And this is a collaboration with the colleagues in Oxford at the Edward Gray Institute. Colleagues Chris Perrins, Ben Sheldon, and Richard Pettifor. Richard Pettifor came on one of our workshops and brought this data set along, and we've analysed it together. So what we have is a longitudinal study of great tits, and basically this is quite time-intensive data to collect. So the team in Oxford, every breeding season for the birds, go to this wood not far from Oxford itself, Wytham Woods, just on the outskirts. And they put up nest boxes and they do all manner of collections over that period. Okay, so they measure the clutch size of any birds that any nesting attempts that they find. The day it was laid, so they go in day after day round the nest boxes looking to see if any eggs have been laid. The mean nestling mass, so when the nest actually comes to fruition, how heavy the nestlings are in the litter. In the clutch, sorry, not the litter, wrong type of animal. And then 3 sort of post-event measures. Was the nest successful? And how we measure that is if any of the fledglings, any of the chicks that formed this clutch, if any of those survived the next breeding season, then that would indicate a successful nest. We also have indicators of whether the male and the female were seen again breeding in future years. Okay, so we've got six responses there, 6 measures that we've taken. As I say, this is a very time-intensive study. We've got 34 years of data, and over that period, we've just got over 4,000 nesting attempts. So we've got 4 ways of classifying the data. For every nest attempt, we know the female bird involved, the male bird involved, the nest box, because these are scattered all through the woods, involved, and the year of the nesting attempt. Okay, so what year might be important for climatic reasons. If there was a cold or a hot year, that might have an impact. The nest box, again, that might be territory. There might be better places in the wood than others. And then the genetics of the birds to see what's going on there. So we can summarize the data structure by looking at each of these sources in turn. And we've got quite a few measures for each year. They do vary from year to year. I think the data gets bigger as time goes on. But we have 34 years. On an average year, there's about 100 plus observations. The nest boxes, there were quite a few of them, about 1,000 for our 4,000 attempts. So we're only seeing on average about 4. And for the male and female birds, there are nearly 3,000 of each of these for our 4,000 nesting attempts. So really, we don't have a lot of information on each bird. And when I saw this data first, I thought, well, there's no way we're going to be able to pull apart, male effects from female effects, when the median number of observations we see for a bird is 1. Okay, that would just be completely confounded. But what we have, the mean is slightly above 1, and so some birds are going to give us more information because they're going to have several breeding attempts. So another way diagrammatically to look at this, here we go from 1964, quite old data, to 1970, and we can see male and female birds, and we can see here male and female birds appear here, where the female bird 1 as an attempt with male bird 1, we come on to 65, male bird 1 is still there, and now it's female bird 5. Okay, and so on and so forth. So really we're seeing, and we see lots of singletons, pair 14 here, bird 14 and 14, that's the only data point we have of them. So we've got no way of saying whether that was the male bird or the female bird that, let me just stop what I'm doing. Okay, and we've looked at these 2 down here, but we've got some impressive birds. So for example, male bird 11 here mates twice with male bird 12. Okay, then the next year is mating again, but this time with 15, and finally with female bird 18. And actually, this is an interesting pair that 15 and 11 mate together, and then 15 has a new partner. So we have all these different patterns here. Okay, so we're going to try, from the limited data that we've got, to pull apart different effects. Okay, so we're going to do univariate modeling, and for each of our responses, we're going to fit quite a straightforward model. We're not going to fit any extra predictors. We're just going to fit our 4 levels of classification. Okay, so we use that notation from my paper in 2001. So here we're going to have an overall mean for whatever our response is. Let's say it's clutch size for a minute. So clutch size is an overall clutch size beta. There's an impact of male bird involved in the nesting attempt, an impact of female, an impact of nest box, an impact of year. Okay, and something to make everything add up, a level 1 residual. And we assume different distributions for each of these. And we're interested in the relative sizes of the different variances, because that tells us how important the different classifications are. We're going to use MCMC in MON, and we're going to use diffuse priors, okay, and ran it for a long time. In actual fact, we've got some binary variables there, the nest success variables. We ran that for even longer. And we used diagnostics to decide whether we'd run it for long enough. And you can do some classical modeling. If you remember, I mentioned some of the work in animal breeding, and some of that stuff was put in, Robin Thompson's work was put into the GenStat software package, so we can get results from that. So let's look at, we're not doing model comparison, let's just look at the model of everything in it. Okay, I haven't actually in this slide put any of the GenStat results, but if you were to look at the paper where I've looked at this, then you'd see that as well. So here is the clutch size. Okay, so these birds on average just under 9 eggs. Okay, and these are the relative the different variabilities. Okay, so there's quite a lot of unexplained variation, and that's not that surprising with the sort of data that we have here. But look, in actual fact, it looks like it's really the female bird that drives how big a clutch size is. And she lays the eggs, so that makes complete sense. Okay, so nearly 40% of the variation is due to the female bird. Virtually no variation is due to the male bird. Okay, there's a little bit of variation due to nest box. Okay, and some more for year. So there are various hypotheses here. You know that you know, maybe the birds are adjusting how many eggs they lay depending on whether the year is good or bad in a way. Okay, so that's quite interesting, and that does show that even with this data set with about 4,000 observations and 3,000 of each type of bird, we can pull out these effects. Okay, so if we move on then to the lay date, okay, so these are days after the 1st of April. So on average, these birds are laying right about the end of April, beginning of May, 29 days after the after April the 1st. Okay, but there is quite a bit of variability here. And this time around, the biggest source of variability is the year. Okay, so climate makes a huge difference in terms of when the birds on average lay their eggs. So a warmer or colder winter will make a difference. There is a difference again for females. Maybe some females are more resistant than others. And once again, the males and the nest boxes don't have much of a say here. Okay. So let's move on to the next measure, which is nestling mass. So this is actually the average mass of the chicks at 10 days old. So not when they were laid, at 10 days old. And what we see for the first time here is that the average is 18 grams, I guess, nearly 19. There's lots of unexplained variation. About 60% of it we can't explain. But for the first time, okay, the male birds have an impact. So here they're not quite as big an impact as the females, but that's kind of interesting, right? So 10 days, the birds share the collecting of food. Okay, so you would expect maybe that male birds will now have a role to play. And year has an effect. Obviously, some years it's easier to collect food than others. Nest box, again, not much of an effect going on there. Okay. So let's finally look at some of these success criteria. How successful are the birds? Okay, and we can see the value 0.01. Okay, so this is a logistic type model. If we translate, it's roughly 0. So remember, roughly 0 in a logistic regression is equivalent to 0.5 or 50%. So 50% of nests are successful. In other words, one of the ring nestlings is captured in later years. What impacts that? Well, the biggest driver there is the year. So some years the weather is terrible and that's going to kill off all the young chicks. Not all of them, although the whole species would disappear, but the number that will survive would be bigger. Okay, but there are some genetics here. So some male birds and some female birds are obviously having more success than others in doing that. And there's a little bit of effect for nest box. Only about 7% here of the overdispersion is due to nest boxes. Okay, so we can similarly look at male survival. What would affect male survival? For once again, so year is the biggest driver. But here, it's males that we're looking at, so the particular male has an impact. Okay, the probability, if we back transform this minus 0.428, is about 0.33. And actually, these numbers are all very small. We're looking at percentages here, but there isn't much overdispersion. And here we're seeing the observed breeding in later years. So the real probability is probably a little bit higher. Okay, most birds that survive the next year, they'll be part of the breeding mix. Okay, but that's what we're seeing with this. And we can see a similar picture if I clear these drawings and move on to the last slide here on the data. Here's the females, and actually the females, interestingly, again, so there's a slightly higher probability here. There's 0.381 of them being observed later. Again, there's not a lot of overdispersion, but this time around, it's actually the nest boxes that they're using and the year that are having an impact. Okay, so maybe there's some geography thing going on there, but we don't overinterpret these because these are overdispersions that are quite small. Okay, so if I clear those drawings, so that's a second example of using cross-classified models in practice. So that's the end of the lecture, really. So what have we covered? So in this third lecture, we've shown how we can extend cross-classified models to 2, 3, 4 different higher classifications, and also to different response types. We looked at some examples here, again, of continuous variables, but also of binary variables. And we can look at Poisson models. We didn't have any examples of those here, but for counts, or even ordered multinomial or unordered multinomial models. We saw how we could use the notation and the classification diagrams in these extended models. We saw 2 examples. The first example, we were looking at how different factors within an artificial insemination data set, and we saw that women were more important than the donor and the donation in terms of whether the attempt would be successful. And we've seen in our second example, lots of predictors related to nesting attempts, and we've shown how we can partition and get biologically reasonable results, where female birds are the driver on things where females like laying eggs, that the females have more control over, but actually when it things like Nestling Mass, where both birds have a role to play in feeding the chicks, the male birds actually have an effect. So hopefully that's the third example. We've also looked at the earlier Fife data example in Scotland, educational example. Hopefully now through these 3 lectures, you've got a good grounding of the types of models you might use cross-classified models for, the types of applications. We're going to finish off after this. We'll also put up on the website a cross-classified practical. So here you can watch, you can try the practical yourself, or you can watch the walkthrough video. And it will cover the Fife and Scotland example that George covered in the second of these talks. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll join us again when we look at multiple membership models. Thank you.